And then Putin, who was a spy master, he wasn't a terribly good one with the KGB, but he was a spy master, begins launches on a new form of conflict, which we now call hybrid war.
Sorry, the phrase is
hybrid
war. Yeah.
A phrase that's very complicated to talk about and understand, but that includes information operations and information warfare that can best be characterized by the term gaslighting. And this is the stock and trade of the Russian hybrid warfare effort. There's a Soviet concept, and there was a terrific paper at the Institute for the Study of War that my wife Kim founded and runs, and that I work with the Russia team there. But there was a terrific paper that they published a few years ago by a woman named Maria Snegovaya on Russian reflexive control, a Soviet reflexive control doctrine, because it was Soviet theorists who articulated this framework in the 50s or 60s, I don't remember, that Putin and his goons have taken and perfected. Reflexive control is the art of creating a picture of the world in your adversary's mind of such a fashion that your adversary voluntarily chooses the course of action that you desire him to choose, thinking that it is in his best interest. That's a very complicated way of saying gaslighting, right? You create a false universe for the adversary to live in. And in that universe, the adversary will naturally do what you want him to do. This is what the Russians have been trying to do.
So I have two questions about that. The first is, as soon as anything like that is put forth, it instantly sounds like a conspiracy theory. And I'm not saying that you're engaging in conspiracy theories, but that's the reflexive response. So what's the evidence in
Great
your
question.
estimate?
Yeah,
and then what's the narrative they're trying to create? How effective has that been? And well, we already understand to some degree why. If the West is being conceptualized as an enemy responsible for Russian chaos, for keeping the Russians down, and for encircling them, depriving them of their just destiny, then we know the motive. There's others, but that's not a bad core motive. What's the warfare aimed at, and what's the evidence that this is occurring, and how and where and how are we subject to it, all of that?
So, right, as soon as you're operating in the information space and as soon as you're dealing with this kind of psychological warfare and stuff, I will tell you there is a mountain of evidence that this is going on and it's deliberate, and lots of people can argue with that. And we can argue about the specifics. But the evidence is, first of all, this is a published Soviet doctrine, which we can read. You can read this, where this is articulated. And then there is Russian doctrine on warfare and on hybrid warfare that also explicitly lays out this framework. So the barrier to entry here is reading Russian. If you can read Russian, then you can read official Russian doctrine and documents laying out the theory of hybrid warfare and how to conduct it. Now, there's one trick in the way that they tend to articulate this most clearly, and we've written about this as a terrific paper. I would commend to your attention by Mason Clark, the Russia team lead at the Institute for the Study of War, on Russian hybrid warfare and particularly lessons from Syria, where they use this approach, and then wrote about it. And so we have writings from actually the guys who are commanding the war against Ukraine right now. The commander of the Southern Military District, General Dvornikov, was a commander in Syria and wrote articulately about what he did there. The commander of the Western Military District, Zhuravlev, is another Syria alum and wrote about his experiences there. So they're quite overt about this stuff. The only trick is, a lot of the time, they describe hybrid warfare as they claim we do it to them. And they describe their activities as defensive against our own hybrid warfare. And that we initiated this hybrid war and they are defending against it. And then in that way, they describe exactly what they have been doing. And so you can see them talking about what they think it is, and then you can see specific actions they take. You can see Russian bot farms that we know work to manipulate our social media a few years ago, but it's still out there. It's still going on.
Okay, so let's tie the hybrid warfare back in. So what's the goal of the hybrid warfare as far as you're concerned?
So the goal of the hybrid warfare has been to try to achieve Putin's objectives without having to do what he's doing in Ukraine right now. Because hybrid warfare is in part a poor man's game. So we talked about the economic devastation that Russia faced in the 90s. Putin inherited that. Putin has never fixed the Russian economy. The Russian economy is still deeply and fundamentally dysfunctional. Oscillations in energy prices have helped him. Various other things that he's done have helped him gain enough money to be able to rebuild his military to some extent. But his military, until very recently, was simply not capable of posing a serious conventional threat to NATO, or hoping plausibly to defend against NATO if the Russians began a war and NATO seriously leaned into it. So the hybrid warfare approach was designed to help him achieve victories in reconstituting Soviet power one way or another without having to fight wars. And it worked pretty well in some important ways, but it reached limits.
How did it win? What ways did it work, do you think?
So what the classic example of hybrid warfare, if you like, was remember the little green men who turned up in Crimea in 2014? And the claims that the Russians were not Russian soldiers, they were local Crimeans who were fed up with alleged Ukrainian oppression and so forth. It became rapidly apparent that they were in fact Russian special forces troops, and that the Russians did in fact have troops in Ukraine. But even that thinnest veneer of implausible deniability led to the following consequence. It led to the establishment by Germany and France with Russia and Ukraine of the Minsk Accords that established the air quotes ceasefire in Ukraine that held ostensibly from 2015 until Putin just broke it by invading. And here's a fascinating thing about the Minsk Accords. Russia is a party to the Minsk Accords as a mediator. What? Russia is a party to the Minsk Accords as a mediator. Nowhere in the Minsk Accords is there a recognition of the fact that it's Russian forces in Ukraine, that the proxy republics that Putin just recognized their independence are Russian controlled, that the chain of command of the forces of those proxies ran to the 8th Combined Arms Army, which is Russia's headquarters in Rostov-on-Don. Nowhere in the Minsk Accords is that recognized.
And you think that was made plausible, rendered plausible, or possible even by a successful disinformation or propaganda campaign?
Yep, because the Russian approach, again, and all of this just changed. So, I mean, there's a whole other inflection that we need to talk about the change that's just occurred. But the Russian approach before this invasion had been to use disinformation, misinformation, and sometimes telling the truth in weird ways to generate the following effect: who really knows? Mm-hmm. That's been the standard that has been sufficient for Putin a high percentage of the time. And unfortunately, the rising skepticism and mistrust within our own society has made that pushing a rock downhill. We so mistrust each other at this point that we're inclined to say, well, who really knows? And so when the Russians are creating these opportunities to say, well, who really knows? The point of that is so that we'll say, well, who really knows? So why should we get involved in this? So that instead of reacting to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which is what actually happened, the Russian military invaded Ukraine in 2014. It seized and then annexed Ukrainian territory in 2014. And then it continued a war in Ukraine from 2014 to the present. The Russian military was doing all of that. Instead of that, we've been talking about ceasefire. I have a sour joke for you, Jordan. I've used this joke right up until the invasion. What do you call it when the armored, mechanized artillery, missile, aircraft, naval, and special forces troops of two countries fight each other? In Ukraine, we call it a ceasefire. because that's what had been
So,
going
so
on.
by sowing chaos and confusion at the level of information, you sap the moral unity of the people
Exactly.
that you're attacking. So they can't unite to justify to themselves even a singular and effective response.
What you do is you isolate the victim, which is what the Russians have done or had done. They isolated Ukraine so that instead of seeing Ukraine simply as the victim of a Russian invasion in 2014, which is what happened, in the West, we've had a lot of conversations about, well, are the Ukrainians living up to their obligations under Minsk? Well, are the Ukrainians doing enough here? And there, you get in rapidly into this, well, faults on both sides kind of thing, which paralyzes Western response. There aren't faults on both sides. Faults on one side here. There are faults on the side of the Russians who invaded in 2014 and have invaded again. That's
So
faults on one side.
that's the consequence of an injudicious even-handedness.
Right, exactly.
That's a tough one because there's the strong moral impulse to even-handedness and also to self-correction, right? To examine yourself for your own faults, which we seem to be more than good enough in some sense in the West.
Yep.
But that can be capitalized on. And it's an interesting moral conundrum, isn't it? Because there's a time for decisive action that requires a certain level of moral certainty, and that means you're not even-handed under those conditions. So, what did we do wrong that made this happen and happen now?
So look, the question, the answer to the question why now is very hard, I think, and this is something that I'm also wrestling with because what we need to explain is the invasion. That Putin has been carrying forward operations to regain control of Ukraine since 2014. He has been pursuing hybrid warfare approaches. He's been pursuing informational operation approaches in Ukraine. He's put various forms of military pressure on Ukraine from his occupied territories.
Right. So it's not exactly now. This is actually an extension of a process that's been occurring for a long time.
It's an inflection in that process. Now, so what we need to explain this particular inflection, which is a huge inflection, but that's actually rather hard, to be honest with you. And there's no simple partisan or straightforward explanation to why Putin decided that he needed to invade now, which is the question that preoccupies me as someone who's focused on Putin's calculus.
Well, the best explanation I've heard so far, and it goes along with this gradualist idea in some sense, is that part of what Putin did while he was attempting to wrest back control of Ukraine, let's say, is build a military presence on the border.
Yeah.
And then the fact that you've done that actually changes the situation substantially. If you're going to if you're much more likely to shoot someone with a gun if you happen to be holding it and pointing it at them as a precursor. And so you could see how a gradualist approach, and his initial idea might have just been, well, we'll build up the military to put even more pressure on the West and to continue this gradualist approach. But once it's there, the situation changes. And then it could be, in some sense, relatively small and relatively random events that precipitate it at any given moment.
So I think it's quite possible that something like that occurred. There's a lot of technical details about, so I want to say on the air to you what I've been saying to other people that I talk to. I got this wrong. Okay, we made a forecast. I and the ISW Russia team made a forecast beginning in November and then carrying forward until very recently that Putin would not launch this huge invasion. And we were wrong. Obviously, he did. And I, as a matter of analytical integrity, I feel it necessary to say to people explicitly, yes, we were wrong in our forecast. And we've spent a lot of time trying to understand and think about why we were wrong and what lessons we can learn from that. Here's one of the reasons why we were wrong. Or let me say, this is one of the reasons why we forecast that he would not do this. Because when you look actually at the technical details of the way that he arrayed his forces around Ukraine, we were watching that and saying, this is going to stink, this military operation that he's conducting. He's not well set up to do this. Surely his professional military officers are going to tell him that this is a bad idea. And it turns out that we were wrong that he would be persuaded by that reality, but we were right that it was a bad idea. because the problems that he's now encountering, we actually did predict that he would have the problems that he's now encountering if he conducted this operation.
Okay, so it isn't obvious what precipitated this, and there isn't an obvious moral to derive from the story, but there are errors in it. And okay, sorry, go ahead.
We'll get to errors, but before we get to our own errors, because I've got to tell you, Jordan, it's one of the things that I'm very focused on is you need to start by blaming the enemy for things the enemy does. I'm happy to talk about what our responsibilities are here, but this was all Putin's decision.
I'm actually more interested in some sense now what our responsibilities are going forward.
Okay.
Right. So because that's the crucial issue. And I'd like to hear. When I commented about mistakes then, I was thinking, you said his troops were badly positioned, his military machine was badly positioned. And so that might mean he was setting it up for other reasons, but defaulted to this.
Right. Why did that happen?
What is the situation he's in now? Because he's not finding allies at that rapid a rate, let's say.
No, he's not finding really allies at all. Look, the first thing I want to say is I think it's quite possible that he decided to launch this invasion because the intent of the mobilization, I think it is possible, the intent of the mobilization was to intimidate both the Ukrainians and the West into surrendering without having to invade. And that he therefore, allowed his military guys to set up a deployment that didn't make sense for an invasion, but was great for threatening. One of the things that happened, the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for at least one thing that it's done, actually for a few things that it's done, deserves some criticism for other things, but for the first time in history that I'm aware of, the Biden administration fought a counter-hybrid warfare campaign back against the Russians. And as the Biden administration became aware of Russian preparations to conduct a coup d'etat in Kyiv, they told the Ukrainians about it, and they told the world about it. As they became aware of multiple Russian preparations to conduct false flag attacks or stage Ukrainian provocations or various other things that would have given Putin informational cover and created a who really knows effect in the minds of people in the West, the Biden administration blew every one of those operations.
Okay, so why is that a hybrid warfare response on Biden's part, and not just, I don't mean just, but not just the utility of straightforwardness and honesty as a response to disinformation and propaganda?
It's both.
Or it's both.
Okay? It's both.
Why both?
We can wage war with the truth because we're not trying to lie. Putin is trying to create a false universe. Putin is trying to create a fictitious universe, and the Biden administration punctured that. I'm calling it hybrid warfare because they reacted to, first of all, Putin engaged in violence, which makes it, politically motivated violence, which makes it warfare. And his guys were conducting deliberate information campaigns to support specific preparations for military activities. And the Biden administration engaged game for game with them on a very tactical level. So it wasn't just sort of blanket telling the truth. It was finding
strategic as well.
Strategic and tactical, blowing all of this
informed.
Cover. Yeah. And you can, by the way, see, I have a little artifact that suggests that this was true because Putin held one of his weirdly publicly staged, National Security Council meetings on Monday. And one of the things that happened was he absolutely humiliated the guy who is the head of his foreign intelligence agency that would have been responsible for a lot of these operations. I mean, he humiliated the guy in public in a way that we've never seen him do before.
Таким образом, согласился бы с предложением Николая Платоновича о том, что нашим, так сказать, западным партнерам можно дать последний шанс с тем, чтобы предложить им в кратчайшие сроки заставить Киев пойти на мир и выполнить Минские соглашения. В противном случае мы должны принять то решение, о котором сегодня говорится.
Что значит, в противном случае вы предлагаете начать переговорный процесс?
Нет, я...
Или признавать суверенитет их?
А я
говорите прямо.
Я поддержу предложение о признании...
Поддержу или поддерживаю? Говорите прямо, Сергей.
Поддерживаю предложение...
Так и скажите, да или нет.
Да? Поддерживаю предложение о вхождении Донецкой и Луганской народных республик в состав Российской Федерации.
Мы об этом не говорим, мы этого не обсуждаем. Мы говорим о признании их независимости или нет.
Да, я поддерживаю предложение о признании независимости.
Хорошо, пожалуйста, садитесь. Спасибо. Владимир Александрович.
And I think he probably was genuinely angry that the guy had allowed the Biden administration to get inside all of these operations. And I'm hypothesizing that Putin decided, in the face of having all of this cover blown, decided that he was just going to go for it instead of waiting for this guy Naryshkin or somebody else to get something. Putin just said, okay, screw it. We've got the forces. I'm tired of this. We're just going to do this. And I don't care that we don't have the informational cover. So frustration and anger in response possibly to the success of the Biden administration sort of defeating all the informational stuff.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting explanation for a tipping point, and certainly not an expected one. So